Hey loves, Haley Steinfeld here. Let's be real. When I'm on the red carpet, everyone wants to know whose dress I'm wearing. But here's the thing. We're so focused on those details, we're missing something that's actually way more important. Breast health. It's wild. Breasts get so much attention, but they're still so ignored when it matters most. Don't know what I'm talking about? Tune in on February 9th and visit yourattentionplease.com. That's yourattentionplease.com. See you then.
Exclusively on ESPN Plus, UFC 312, Saturday. Reigning middleweight champion Dricus du Plessis defends his title in a rematch against Sean Strickland. And Zhang Wei Li defends her strawweight title against undefeated Tatiana Suarez. UFC 312, Saturday at 10 p.m. Eastern. Buy it on ESPNplus.com/PPV.
Agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. Ken, it's great to be doing the show with you.
It's great to be back, Trey.
Well, I got to do the show with Mike a couple of weeks ago, kind of out of the blue to help with Jay, and that was a lot of fun. I don't often get to do that, and then we get to kind of get back and do our normal. I will warn listeners, though, for a minute, I am still recovering from the flu, and so my voice might be a little bit off, especially as the show goes on. I just want you to be aware of that. But Mike is he's off gallivanting around the world, Ken. So we wish him well on those endeavors. So
you must have been pretty tough on him last week, Trey, if you got him to flee the country after you were through him.
Well, listen, I mean, somebody's got to push back against his mild socialist views. But now I get to be with you, and you're more radical leftism, and we don't.
Yes.
I guess we're not going to do a lot of Supreme Court stuff today, but we'll see where it all takes us. I know that we were going to start here. There is so much, and I don't know about you, Ken. It's hard a little bit to keep up when it comes.
It is hard to keep up.
Well, especially with all the daily. Here's what's coming from the Trump administration. The total number of just executive orders that are coming out is a lot to keep up with. And some observers consider that kind of is part of the feature and not the bug. That's what's trying to happen. But I'm going to try to focus on a few here. Ken, kind of get your insight into this. I've had some thoughts about this, and then make sure if I've missed something, you can come back at me with it. But I thought where we would start is the kind of DOGE, what's been going on with Elon Musk, USAID, or effectively what you might think of is the spending push or the reining in of spending purportedly by the Trump administration. And look, on the face of it, I love the idea of a White House looking to ensure that spending is under control. That's something that I think any good, true conservative libertarian would be excited about. But what's really tied up here isn't probably even primarily about spending, but really some larger questions about the scope, the extent, and the limits on executive power. And so let's start by kind of putting some of this into perspective, right? We have DOGE, which is this task force, despite its name, that has been assigned by Donald Trump, headed now by Elon Musk, to find ways to fire federal workers and cut programs and regulations. That's its task force mandate right there. And as National Review pointed out, which is not exactly a liberal rag, that kind of action would require a lot of congressional input. As a matter of fact, National Review, even earlier on, kind of wished it well, but didn't think there'd be a lot of congressional help. What has happened, though, in practice, though, is there hasn't been any congressional input, and this has led to a lot of questions of legality. So DOGE is created by an executive order, actually on day one. And again, this is not some new cabinet-level department. but rather the renamed, I don't know if you knew this part, Ken, or not, I'm curious. It's the renamed United States Digital Service Task Force, which was actually originally launched under President Barack Obama way back in 2014 to improve the federal government's digital capabilities following the rocky rollout of care.gov website. Now, Musk himself is what Carolyn Levitt has deemed, quote, a special government employee, end quote. And for those of you not on the in, what that is a very temporary appointment that allows an individual to work 130 days per year for the federal government. It also makes him subject to very different ethics and disclosure rules than what what are considered regular federal employees. So there's a lot of weirdness already right there. And here's kind of the touchstone where I thought we might start with. Recently, DOGE gained access to the Treasury Department's payment system, but according to a letter to Congress, it was only read access. However, despite the Justice Department saying that that was going to be the case, they were going to limit that to that. The reporting coming out right now from Wired and Fox is that, and this seems to be already kind of confirmed by Elon Musk himself in a post on X yesterday, is that they either did have write access, and specifically one of his kind of teenage task members was in fact doing some writing, or they did in the past tense have read access, which would mean that note to Congress was inaccurate. So, Ken, let's start here. We've got some technical legal questions. We've got this larger question. What is your thoughts so far about what we're going on with DOGE? Because when I take a look at this myself, again, I'm not an administrative law expert, but I did look at some administrative law experts. As a matter of fact, David Super from Georgetown Law, he said that the moves were, quote, so wildly illegal that his assumption is that they're, quote, playing a quantity game and assuming the system can't react to all the illegality at once, end quote. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to me to be correct. But the caveat would be that, a lot of it is being concealed from us. So, things that are being done secretly, or even that, that to the extent that people have noticed them, there's questions about whether there's accurate representations, even in courts, about the extent of what's being done. And until we actually know what's being done, we can't authoritatively say whether it's legal or illegal. But the fact that there's so much concealment going on of things that seem illegal would make me feel comfortable to agree with the statement that you read, that this is a massive criminal enterprise essentially to undermine our constitutional system of separation of powers.
So I've been thinking about this in broad terms, and like I've said, I've been thinking about this in broad terms, and one of the things that strikes me, and I'm not a legal scholar, but I'm certainly a presidential scholar. And one of the things, I'm curious about your take on this. When I look at what's happening with DOGE, I don't see a good faith effort to rein in spending. I don't see a legal effort, especially given the kind of furlough processes they're using. Like you say, the things that we can see, that's certainly not the actual way that furlough works. But what I guess concerns me as a presidency guy is that I don't think it's all that shocking that we're here. And one of the things that we have long seen, I was teaching about this, as a matter of fact, today in my class, a student was asking kind of afterwards and said, I don't understand, why do you read the Constitution, you take a look at early precedents, it doesn't appear that presidents have, this significant amount of power. And that's not a terrible early reading when you're first taking a look at it. But over the course of time, both parties have been more and more willing to allow the presidency to have more and more and more and more and more power over time. it almost seems inevitable that at some point you'd have someone like Donald Trump who's going to take the last guardrails off of it. And here was what hit me. Maybe this was anew. I'm also a comparativist. You take a look. One of the weird things about our American system is that it's one of the presidential systems that has avoided executive or dictatorial control. And I was thinking back to grad school, Ken, and I couldn't help but think about professors who are on both sides. You kind of ask them like, well, why does this almost ironclad rule of political science, presidential systems fail? Why does that not apply to the United States? And, more conservative members like Dr. Berrio would say, well, look, it has to do with the culture of America. We would never allow these kind of guardrails to go off the presidency. And more left-leaning scholars who studied like Latin America and South America, they would say, well, it's because of some kind of technical differences in constitutional structures. And so the American constitutional structure is not the best. Obviously, it's not as democratic as it could be. But with these checks in place, it can exist even though it's going to be an outlier systematically. But it seems to me that we've just been kind of resting the whole system on growing presidential power, despite the evidence as a comparativist and a presidentialist that eventually that doesn't work. And I kind of feel like we've arrived at that moment. What do you think about that analysis of DOGE?
No, I don't agree with it. I think that there's a couple things where I don't see Trump as part of a continuum. I see him as really a radical break from American traditions, because the thing that you're talking about, I think when you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the phenomenon that you're observing when you're saying that we've been consolidating more and more power in the executive is mainly the growth in administrative agencies. That administrative agencies are mostly part of the executive branch, and Congress has vested more and more policy decisions.
What's the bureaucratic? To be clear, because I want you to respond to the right thing, I am talking about the increase in desire for unilateral presidential action without the insight or oversight of Congress, and Congress rather using that as a ploy then for re-election bids. So I hear you. There is, in fact, a scholarship suggesting about the growth of the administrative state, but I want to be clear that I'm not positing that one. The same. I'm positing the unitary theory.
I really want to distinguish that from presidential power. I think there certainly has been a lot of growth in the executive branch agencies as the primary engine for policymaking, rather than Congress being the primary engine for policymaking. I agree with that, but I don't think that is a move in a kind of towards monarchy. I don't think that's a move. I think administrative agencies are subject to a tremendous amount of legal constraint and judicial supervision.
Well, what about that unitary theory of the presidency that we have continued to, since the late 1970s forward? I mean, again, I think about Barack Obama running against Hillary Clinton in the primary and basically saying, listen, you're too in love with the unitary theory of the presidency. I mean, he made a pretty sophisticated argument to that front. We need to roll back. We need fewer executive actions. We need to work with Congress. And then I can't help but recall I was in grad school at the time, and Barack Obama becomes the next president of the United States, and quickly begins doing the same thing that he had critiqued Hillary Clinton for what he thought that she was going to do.
I don't agree that he did that. That's I just don't agree that he did that. I think that the critique from the right, which I hear you echoing, is really to conflate arbitrary presidential action from reasoned deliberative action by administrative agencies that are also located in the executive branch. And I don't see that a lot of, even Republican presidents as well as Democratic presidents, I don't see that they really did anything as that were systematic assaults on the rule of law the way Trump is doing. I think what they did was Congress did, delegate more and more policymaking discretion in our system to agencies, but the agencies always had to exercise those subject to lots of rule of law safeguards.
No, I agree with that. And again, I want to set aside that kind of bureaucratic argument about agency creep, because I recognize that is a conservative argument, but I am trying to very carefully not make that particular argument. I'm talking about the total number of executive unitary actions that presidents take. Trump ended up having the most, almost every president, with the exception of Biden in contemporary times, have had more than the one that has gone before them. And we tend to put more and more lawmaking procedures into unitary executive actions. So I hear you, but a unitary executive action is separate from, say, an agency making a rulemaking decision through a process that has been designed by Congress.
It's not different because usually that's what the past president's executive orders have called for. So you can't just count executive orders and say, well, they each issue more executive orders than the predecessor. That's a meaningless statistic unless you actually look at what the executive orders are saying. And if the executive orders
they have become more and more expansive. And we tend to dismantle more of the previous administrations as we move forward. And that's not exact. I'm not exactly out on the fringe of presidential theory there.
Even a case, I'll take a case where the Supreme Court ruled against the Biden administration, and I'm still going to argue that it's nothing like anything Trump's doing. So, Biden, tried to forgive student loan debt, and there was an argument about whether that's the kind of thing that needed to be done by Congress or whether it could be done by the executive. And ultimately, the court ruled against Biden on that. But the point is, even the critics who say the president shouldn't be doing that, if you look at how he went about doing that, he directed the Secretary of Education to do a notice and comment rulemaking, to make use of the statutes that might authorize it, and to try to issue an order in the orderly course based on an order that would state its statutory authority and its fact findings, and that would be subject to judicial review. And then they did forgive the debt, and they stated a statutory and regulatory legal basis for it from statutes that were enacted by Congress. And then the court, in the orderly course of judicial review, said, well, they overstepped and the statute didn't give them that much authority. And in a case like that, which begins with a presidential executive order, but then proceeds through a rulemaking process in the ordinary course, subject to ordinary judicial review, sometimes the president will lose those cases, as Biden lost that one. But I don't think that's an assault on our constitutional system. But I think it's just completely different in kind than anything that Trump is doing now. Trump's purposely trying to just flood the zone with illegality in order to overwhelm the capacity of the system to police that illegality.
I think we have maybe a difference of degree. I hear what you're saying, but I disagree. The point where I think we have the disagreement, so let me start and focus there, is, or maybe the agreement, right? I think we both agree that the zone is getting flooded with illegality, right? I think we agree on that. And I think DOGE is a kind of a phenomenal example of that, especially since we're using, again, task forces and kind of manipulating them into being seemingly, departments to then have access to information that they ought not have access to. And let's be honest, and we haven't talked about this yet, the point here, although it is theoretically about downsizing spending, is really about emphasizing loyalty and control to President Trump. And I think there we have a broad agreement. Where I think we have some disagreement here is on this larger front, the idea. Charles Colwin is a great example of this. He's the author who originally takes a look at these kinds of theses early on about presidential accumulations of unilateral power outside and in addition to the bureaucratic structure of the presidency, and suggesting that power over time is pretty obviously and quantitatively larger. And that falls into theories of what we see happening in other countries where presidents end up slowly accumulating more and more, again, putting aside even bureaucracies, direct action, unitary memorandums, directives, policies that allow them to bypass the legislative branches of their countries. And once you have a strong enough president in place, it doesn't take long then for a Trump-like figure to flood the zone, as we're talking about and agreeing about here, and tipping the system from a constitution, a maybe precariously balanced constitutional system to a no longer balanced constitutional system. But I think that's maybe
the difference. Yeah. Let me try to simplify my point a little bit more. I think it makes an enormous difference whether Congress intentionally delegates authority to the president, which the president can then exercise, or whether the president violates the law. And I think that the phenomenon that you are noting, pre-Trump, could largely be characterized as Congress has been enacting statutes to relieve itself of some of its obligation to do policymaking, and it has authorized presidents to do policymaking that might have been done by Congress. And so when the presidents do that policymaking, it's consistent with law. It may be more, in a more ideal world, Congress would do more policymaking itself, but Congress has intentionally delegated some away, and the president is exercising that. That's not a threat to our constitutional system when Congress delegates authority to the president and the president exercises it. It's a threat to our constitutional system when Congress steals authority when the president steals authority that Congress withheld from him.
So I agree with you. However, what I'm suggesting is that presidents in small ways, not flooding the zone ways, do this consistently. So I'll point, for example, to Daphne Rennan, Professor Daphne Rennan. Not only is she a scholar of presidential power, she in fact worked in Obama's Justice Department, and she herself says that presidents breach beyond those walls. And she puts it this way. She says, look, presidents are designed to broker and break norms. And the question then is how others respond. And our presidents will purposefully, in small ways, they crack at that. And those create new presidential precedents as we move. And again, and she both studied it and worked for the Obama Justice Department, arguing that those kinds of norm stress testing is the underlying. Either if you're a president, if you think the presidency ought to be big, it's the way the presidency expands. If you worry about it, like I do, you see that as being a potential go. What I'm suggesting is that presidents, I agree with you, generally do what you're suggesting. But on key areas, they have historically broken those norms slightly and here and there to expand for future presidents their presidential scope. The problem, though, is that the assumption is that no president would be brazen enough to not just do it here and there, but rather to, as we've kind of put it, flood the entire zone and crack it on the wall. But the historical precedent problem is that all presidents have breached those norms in small ways. That's how you have a president that's as powerful today and not as powerful it was 100 years ago. Until you have a president like Donald Trump who comes in and says, forget all of it. Why? If I can breach it just a little bit here, I can breach it everywhere. I feel like Dr. Seuss.
Yeah. Well, I know we're looking through slightly different lenses because I'm looking through a legal lens and you're looking through a historical lens. But I will say 90 years ago, we had President Franklin Roosevelt. He was a very strong president. He broke a lot of norms. But my point would be, even while he completely, changed the norm about the relationship between the federal government and the national economy, made it much more interventionist than what our tradition had held before that. He did all of that by getting Congress to pass laws that did all of that. He didn't do it illegally. The whole New Deal was done with legislation that empowered the government to change the relationship that it had previously had to the national economy. So I certainly would agree that strong presidents change norms, but I think that can be good. But the right way to do that is consistent with the law. And there's a legal scholar at Yale Law named Bruce Ackerman who has a book called Constitutional Moments, and he writes about the idea that we basically had very radical revisions of our understanding of our system of government, both at the time of the Civil War and again at the time of the New Deal, and he looks at that and so the presidents we're talking about here are Lincoln and FDR mainly, and gives a theory that that happened because the support in the public for those kinds of changes at that time, in response to crises that existed at those times, became so overwhelming that presidents got elected, with large enough majorities in the Congress that they could radically rework norms and come up with new kinds of laws. But again, that isn't done in violation of laws. That's what's completely novel about what Trump's doing here. And of course, he didn't even get a majority of the votes. So it's not analogous to the situation of FDR, who comes in with so many votes that he can basically dominate Congress.
Now, it's true. Now, the difference, of course, between the era of FDR and today is the relative power of Congress is far weaker today than it was then to get things done. I mean, again, I am not suggesting, I'm not trying to suggest that I'm a defense of the actions of Trump. What I'm suggesting is that I think we have long ignored the edifice on which we have carelessly built the presidency, contemporary era, i.e. the 1970s forward. And so we enjoy it when we see presidents like, for example, Obama used executive orders to clearly expand immigration protections via DACA. Now, I thought that's a good thing. Woohoo, yay. But of course, that was, as numerous scholars at the time pointed out, not in the actual legal wheelhouse of the president to so do. But presidents do it. They push on those areas, and they don't do it. They don't. But Obama doesn't do 20 of them. He doesn't do 30 of them. He doesn't do 50 of them, or how and the system is not going to be able to take the impact of an individual, President Trump, doing 50 of them.
Well, actually, it was within his legal wheelhouse, and the Supreme Court did decide a case called United States versus Texas in 2016, and they did uphold what Obama had done under DACA, and that was based on a reading of a statute that always allowed the president to make exemptions or exceptions and not deport people that were otherwise deportable. That was actually in the text of the Immigration Nationality Act. And it was also based in part on a long settled understanding that part of the executive power is the power to set resource allocation priorities within the different agencies of the government. So he could, make it a higher priority to deport other people who are here without proper documentation than the group of people that classified as the dreamers, and the court upheld all that. So I think it's again, I look at that as right-wing propaganda to say that it's he was doing something illegal there. No court held that it was illegal. Well, maybe some lower courts did, but the Supreme Court didn't hold that it was illegal. And it was all completely transparent, public, open, and subject to judicial review.
Well, I mean, again, I'm going to be careful there on the propaganda. I mean, the individuals that I'm citing and putting forward, I mean, we're talking about legal scholars who cross the political divide, having named already a few of them. So I wouldn't put that as in the category of propaganda. I mean, we might disagree with them, but that's a little bit different.
To say
than
that
like
he was illegal,
it's a little different than like quoting Joe Rogan.
Yeah. But what basis would there be to say that it was illegal?
Well, I mean, again, that's going to be a longer conversation that we can probably have right here. That'd be an interesting one in and of itself. I'm specifically thinking about Neil Eggleston's view. He had been White House counsel 2014 to 2017, who makes that particular suggestion pretty straightforwardly. But again, let's come back. I mean, maybe we're getting into the weeds a little bit here. So here's my larger question for us, because then we got to move forward to other stories as well. We've primarily looked at the action here as it relates to Treasury. Obviously, we haven't even touched on USA aid. We haven't on the fact that things from as being as straightforward as blatantly lies as that Politico is getting subsidized by millions of dollars to others. What about the issue here, not just in terms of access to things, but what about in terms of Congress has delegated funds, and this goes back to, as a matter of fact, Nixon, and now Trump saying, well, I don't have to then distribute those funds. But we do have some Supreme Court cases on that front, because through some of the problems there as well.
Yeah, so that's a long and very well settled by now area of law. It was not well settled, as you said, when President Nixon started doing it. So Nixon, who got elected as a Republican president with a Democratic Congress, and the Democratic Congress was had been, even while Johnson was president, and still while Nixon was president, was passing budgets with a lot of appropriations for a lot of programs that Nixon did not support. And he claimed an executive power of impoundment. So impoundment was the word for it. And what impoundment meant was basically his understanding of the executive power was that just like, in other areas that, like the kind we were just talking about, presidents have some control over the resource allocation of executive resources. He argued that meant that if Congress budgeted a certain amount of money for something, it really meant that he could spend up to that amount of money, and he could spend less. He didn't have to spend the whole amount of money. And based on that theory, he started impounding appropriated funds and just directing the Treasury Secretary not to release those funds for things that he thought he didn't want federal money spent on. So when that happened, Congress passed a statute called the Impoundment Control Act, and that statute was enacted in 1974, and it basically says that Congress, when it appropriates funds, intends that the funds be spent and not impounded, and that going forward, Congress can identify funds that it is giving the president impoundment authority over. But if it doesn't identify funds that way, then the default rule under the Impoundment Control Act is Congress intends that the funds be spent and that they not be impounded. And so as soon as that act got enacted in 1974, the Nixon administration didn't comply with it, and so there was a Supreme Court decision. The decision was called Train versus the City of New York, and in the Train versus the City of New York case in 1975, the holding of the case was that the president cannot frustrate the will of Congress by killing a program through impoundment, and that the Impoundment Control Act was constitutional, and the president had to comply with it. And that's not even the last chapter in this story, because I'm quite sure I agree with the holding in Train, but there's actually a later case that goes even further in that direction that I think is not rightly decided. I would actually side with the president in this one, but the Supreme Court didn't. There's a later case called Clinton versus New York, which happened in 1997. And what happened in 1997, which you may remember, Trey, that's the only year in the last 100 years with a budget surplus. Right?
Yeah. Yep. We had.
So there's a budget. Yep. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, please continue.
So there's the federal government runs a budget surplus in 1997, and that happens for a couple reasons. Clinton is president. Gingrich has taken over the Congress. There's a lot of activity around government, threatened government shutdowns and things, and that they negotiate a pretty tight budget. And that's a couple of years after Clinton has already gotten a tax increase through. So the taxes went up in 93. Then the Republicans came in 94, and then spending got cut a lot. So that causes this balanced budget, or the surplus budget.
The only time we've actually had a spending decrease with a tax increase.
Yeah, and that did happen because I think the Dems had complete control of the government in 93, and they raised the taxes, and then the Republicans came in right after that and cut the spending. But part of the spending cutting was that Congress actually made an exception to that Impoundment Control Act. And so you'll remember the Impoundment Control Act in 1974 says, unless we say otherwise, we mean for every dollar we appropriate to actually be spent. So in 96, when Gingrich is running the Congress, they pass another statute, which is an exception to the Impoundment Control Act. And it says in the next budget year, when we enact the budget, we actually intend for this year's budget, the opposite of the Impoundment Control Act. We intend that the president is entitled to use a line item veto and strike out any spending line that he wants to, unless we've identified it as one that we don't want impounded. But this time, the default rule will be that impoundment is permissible. And again, So Train had just said Congress can control that, and now Congress is finally controlling it in the opposite direction and saying not that we don't want impoundment, but for this year's budget we do want impoundment. So Clinton struck out a couple of line items. One was to a potato growers cooperative in Idaho, and another one was I think was going to forgive New York City. Forgive New York City Hospital from repaying some Medicaid overpayments that it had collected. And so New York was the plaintiff here. New York was supposed to get this debt forgiveness. Clinton line itemed it out, and they sued. And the Clinton administration argued, and I think correctly, that that since Congress actually authorized him to impound these funds, this is consistent with Train, and he can impound the funds because he's doing it with congressional permission, not contrary to congressional lack of permission. And both Justice Scalia and Justice Breyer, who typically wouldn't be on the same side of cases, but what they have in common is that they were both administrative law professors. They agree with me and with the White House here, but the majority of the court comes out the opposite way, and the majority of the court says no, even if Congress wants to, they can't give the president a line item veto. Our U.S. Constitution doesn't have a line item veto. So if they've already appropriated the funds, they can't authorize him to impound the funds. He must spend the funds, and if they didn't want him spent, they shouldn't have authorized him. Now, I actually think that's a wrong holding, but that's the holding, and that goes
to be
even
clear,
farther
they
than
hold
the
it in part, and this is what Scalia ends up railing against. They argue that it goes against the Constitution's presentment portion of the Constitution. That because and they really fixate on the idea of it being a veto and not having to do with the impoundment, and so they make an argument that it violates the presentment clause. But
that's exactly right.
Now that starts to get us into doing our midweek show when we get into the details.
Let me just explain that since you said it, but you did say it right. But I think just so the listeners will understand it.
I see you looking at me.
Can I have your attention, please? Yes, hi, Wanda Sykes here. You ever think about all the nicknames we have for breasts? Boobs, tatas, the girls, chesticles, bubbies. Heck, you might even have your own nickname for them. And yet, even though they get so much attention, they're still so ignored when it matters most. What's up with that? Well, on February 9th, tune in to see why I'm talking so much about breasts and visit yourattentionplease.com to learn more.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kan du norsk?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
The way Justice Stevens, who writes the majority opinion in Clinton v. New York, the way he looks at this is he says, well, what we have here is we have the 1997 budget statute that passed, and it had all these line items of spending in it. And Clinton signed the whole bill into law. And so the whole bill was presented to him, including the items that he later canceled. But then when he later canceled those spending items, that means he changed the law after he signed it.
Yep.
And changing the law after he signs it is what violates the presentment clause. The presentment clause, the way Stevens is interpreting it, says, the president can only sign the same bill that Congress presented to him. He can't sign a different bill than Congress presented to him, and he can't make a change in the bill that Congress didn't present to him. So that's the technical argument that the majority uses to say why Clinton can't have a line item veto, even if Congress is trying to give him one. But I think I actually really do agree with the Scalia and Breyer dissent more. And I think what they said is, well, but Congress also enacted the separate bill that gave him that line item veto,
right.
And they presented it to him.
It has nothing to do with
really
presentment.
only what. It had nothing to do with presentment, that both bills were presented to him. He's got one bill that was presented to him that says you can spend money on these items. And you've got another bill that was presented to him that says, but you don't have to spend the money on these items. And he signed both of those bills into law. And then he was just executing them both. He wasn't changing them.
Well,
he was
Scalia
if you think about how
says, look, if we would have called it something else, then we wouldn't have this issue. Different.
So if he's got a law that says you can spend this money, but you don't have to, then he's executing the law either by spending it or by not spending it. But he's not changing it. So I actually do agree that Congress can give the president a power of impoundment. But I agree, especially with the train case, that that's up to Congress. And if Congress doesn't give him the power of impoundment, he doesn't have it. And that is what the train case holds. Clinton goes even farther than that. So it's really very clear that the president doesn't have a power of impoundment.
No, well, and again, I think that's what's going to come up, especially when we take a look at USAID. But I'm going to pause this. I mean, that's it. I mean, I could talk about presidential stuff all day, obviously, and we still need to talk about some presidential stuff. We need to shift gears a little bit, Ken, because we've also had all the tariff stuff going on over last weekend and then this week, and we want to make sure to at least get to talking about that. So let's shift a little bit. Let's talk about tariffs for a minute. So last weekend, right as Mike was doing the show, Trump had been threatening tariffs on Canada and Mexico at 25%. But in the hours before that executive order was to go into effect on Tuesday, he postpones them. Now, a 10% tariff does end up going into effect on China. So what is it with this most beautiful word in the English language, tariffs? So I thought, Ken, we were already being detailed. So let's continue to be a little technical here. See if everybody will come along for the ride and talk a little bit about what's going on. So to begin with, let's just a little bit of political economy, right? Tariffs are taxes on goods that are coming into a country, right? So you import something and you pay a tax on it that you wouldn't pay if it was made in the state in question. And depending on the state where it's coming from, it can have different tax rates, and those are tariffs. Now, depending on what economic school you exist in, there's a variety of reasons why you would want or not want taxes, i.e. tariffs, on money coming into a country, right? You might be doing it to raise funds for the country. We're talking about that a second ago. You might be doing it to try to change consumer behavior or as a way of trying to increase overall state power, kind of a mercantilist view. So in the United States, we have, with some exceptions in the modern period, been largely trade. And this goes back to a guy named David Ricardo. And he kind of said, look, different countries have different competitive economic advantages. And so if you trade freely, you're going to get the best of both worlds. You'll get to sell the stuff that you make at the best price, and you'll buy at the best price the stuff that other countries make. That's a simplified version of it, but there we go. Now, in the United States, Democrats and Republicans, they've oftentimes switched on these tariff issues, really kind of depending on their constituencies. And that's what we've been seeing happening recently. Now, the modern tariff era, and there's actually a whole funniness about this in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. In the early months of the Great Depression, we enact one of the largest, and here in academia, the most studied tariff structures in all of history. That's the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. And so what Smoot-Hawley did, besides bore Ferris Bueller, was set off a whole conversation, not just during the Great Depression, but about the debates and the practicalities of protectionism versus free trade. So the Smoot-Hawley was our largest tariff protecting act, and the tariff raised prices on thousands of goods. And what it was designed to do was protect agricultural, manufacturing, and other domestic sectors in the United States. And proponents of Smoot-Hawley, what they thought was going to happen with those higher tariffs would encourage domestic consumption of particular home-produced goods and stabilize markets. In contrast, critics really worried that such protectionism would lead to retaliatory measures and create global instability. Now, the legacy of Smoot-Hawley, and I think it applies even to what we're talking about today, is we did in fact have retaliation tariffs from other countries in the same way that we saw Canada and Mexico and China. Well, primarily Mexico and Canada argue that they were going to have kind of retaliations to that. There is a lot of question. Many political economists point to Smoot-Hawley as being what intensifies and spreads the Great Depression. The magnitude of that still debated today among economists and political scientists. But if you want to do a really good work on it, one of my former professors, Dr. Rothgeb, he has a whole set of works where he studied specifically Smoot and its protectionist policies. In the aftermath of all of that, we end up with all of the multilateral trade institutions that we see today as we kind of undid it slowly. So you get the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, or today, as rounds of GATT, you get to the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. And all of these institutions are founded on principles of trying to liberalize trade and reduce trade barriers. And so now we get to the contemporary period. And so tariffs are once again the subject of debate. Trump has brought it back to the forefront, particularly as certain sectors have grappled with globalization and manufacturing jobs. And so as more of those have moved overseas, the idea of having selective tariffs have become, especially as negotiating items, have become more popular. As a matter of fact, Democrats have generally favored tariffs. They were opposed to the original North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Kind of saw Bill Clinton as having sold them out, as being the one to work on that. More recently, we've seen kind of that shift where Donald Trump worked with Democrats in his first term to create the current North American agreement. And I'm happy that Democrats seem to be coming over to the trade side again, but it seems that the free trade era of Republicans has really largely ended since 2016, replaced with more populist Republicans like Donald Trump, who want to kind of return us to a mercantilist view, right? So it's time for tariffs, and it's time to understand trade in a zero-sum game. So, Ken, this week, we end up not getting tariffs on Canada or Mexico for now. They're getting a 30-day with reprieve. And specifically what Trump has been citing has been fentanyl and illegal immigrants as a result of needing these 25% tariffs. And so what Canada and Mexico have done is they've agreed to send about 10,000 troops to the border and be crack down on fentanyl, if you will. What that means pragmatically is a little weird. The other bit here you might think about this, like, Smoot-Hawley, that's an act of Congress. Where does this ability of the president to do this unilaterally come from? And specifically, Trump is using a particular law to the IEEPA to allow it to say, look, there's an emergency, and then therefore we can make these used. The last time we've seen this used with Biden and Russia. So this is the beginning of the trade deals. We've talked about this a little bit. Ken, are you happy about the tariffs? Not happy about the tariffs because of them being so capricious? I am honestly curious where you fall in that, given I know we've had some disagreements on trade before.
Yeah. Well, I would say I can very much separate, again, the rule of law issues from the policy issues. And to me, the rule of law issues are much more important than the policy issues. So
we'll start there. Please.
Yeah. I mean, he is clearly violating the law. And one thing about NAFTA that is interesting, and it's a detail a lot of people might not know.
You mean the original NAFTA, or do you mean the current? Goodness, I'm blanking on the name all of a sudden. Because we don't have NAFTA.
The NAFTA was negotiated in 93 and 94, and it was enacted. It was enacted here as a statute. So that's the thing I wanted to say. Now, so we still have that statute. It's had a few amendments since then, but normally when we're talking about international,
in 2018 with, and I cannot think of the name, and it is also passed as a law. Because we talked about it on this show.
Yeah, as a law.
But yeah, it's a law, but I can't think of the name. Oh my goodness. What is the name of the
And the renegotiated version of it only made minor amendments to the 1994 law. It
increased some tariff barriers effectively for particular sectors. Yeah.
Yeah, but the thing I'm trying to get at is, normally when we talk about international treaties or international agreements, there's always a debate about whether those are actually law here in America or not. And the general understanding of treaties is that they're not really law in the ordinary sense, and so they don't really need to be complied with. But that is definitely not true about NAFTA, because
USMCA
NAFTA was
USMCA.
USMCA, yeah.
And that one is also
NAFTA, as
passed
amended by UN.
it's passed as a domestic statute. Continue. You're absolutely right. I'm sorry, but I wanted to get that right.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. That these are all passed only as domestic statutes. In fact, the process by which international treaties get ratified is that the president ratifies them. The president enters them, and then there has to be a 2/3 vote in the Senate to ratify, and the House plays no role in that. But that never even happened with NAFTA. The thing that happened with NAFTA was President Clinton negotiated it, and they actually skipped that step of asking the Senate to ratify it. And because they actually wanted it to be binding law in the United States, they just enacted it as an ordinary domestic statute. So there's a statute that's technically called the North American Free Trade Agreement Implementation Act, which was enacted as a domestic statute by Congress.
And
there's
that's
not
the same
even
thing with
anything that's a treaty.
USMCA. Yes, continue.
Yeah. And there's not even a treaty. If you looked in the treaties of the United States, you'll never find NAFTA. It was never ratified as a treaty. It was only enacted as a statute. And part of the reason for that was so that it would in fact be binding law, and it's enforceable in several courts. NAFTA, there is a U.S. federal court. It's a specialized court called the Court of International Trade. It usually sits in New York or Washington. And NAFTA is enforceable by Canada and Mexico in ordinary U.S. court, the Court of International Trade, and it's also enforceable through a binational or trinational panel that has judges also from Mexico and Canada as well as the U.S. And the NAFTA statute itself says that court can also enforce it. So this doesn't have that kind of squishy quality of a typical treaty. This is actually binding domestic law in the United States, enforceable in the United States, and there's nothing in NAFTA that gives the president any of the authorities that he's claiming now, and even he acknowledges that. So as you pointed out, he's primarily relying on a different statute, not on the NAFTA statute.
Yeah, the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act.
Economic Powers Act. Yeah, which is a statute that primarily, like, the actual normal use of that statute is a typical kind of thing would be when the Iranians took all the hostages in the 70s, and Iran had a lot of financial accounts on Wall Street and real estate that it owned in the United States. The President Carter used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to freeze all those assets during the pendency of the hostage crisis. So the concept here is that if there's a bona fide emergency that we need to use some kind of sanctions or some kind of asset freezing or something like that, it authorizes the president through executive orders to say, there's an emergency and I need to take this emergency response. But it's a fairly extreme abuse of that to so it's with Canada. What's the emergency that supposedly?
Well, they're not becoming a 51st state. That's obviously an emergency, Ken.
Yeah, that's the emergency. Or I think he said because 1% of the fentanyl that comes into the United States comes in through Canada.
That's a generous reading because it was not clear. I looked carefully. It is just kind of a fentanyl and illegal immigrants is the best you can kind of get from the read.
Right, and the numbers don't bear out that that's bona fide, and so I think the kind of sort of very blatant disregard for domestic U.S. law that has been on the books for decades, that's been operating very well, that was enacted with both bipartisan support and bipartisan opposition. And you were talking about that earlier.
Well, and the reason I keep coming back to the USMCA about it, Ken, is I think one of the things that highlights your point, and I think on this one we're going to agree a lot, but I think you're actually understating your point. Who was it who negotiated and convinced Congress to pass SCA?
Trump. It was
Trump.
Trump.
It's 2018. So he's arguing that his own deal is bad.
Yeah.
And then he is,
Right.
and he's pointing to an act to undo what he did via Congress.
Yes.
To overrule himself.
And if he's got problems with,
and so in this case, I know earlier we disagreed in a different way. I think in this one, I think you're understating your case.
How much this isn't flying in the face of the rule of law, and to me, that's incredibly much more important than whether this is good policy or bad policy. Like, it's much more important to comply with law than to worry about whether it's good policy or bad policy. And if he thinks that the current NAFTA has too much free trade in it and we need less, he can go to Congress and seek further amendments of that, and he can make his policy arguments there. But he can't just violate the law. That's really, again, it's just absolutely undermining our democratic system of governance and of separation of powers, and undermining the rule of law in ways that do much more damage. And it seems also designed to really upset, our system of alliances. And I've said before, I think he is actually taking direction from Putin on this. I think, Putin has given him marching orders to, really upset all of America's closest alliances and just. Yeah.
I think you've gone a bridge too far now. I mean, listen, I get I think it might align with things that Putin wants, like true. But no, Donald Trump thinks that he can make incredible deals. That's him. You read these things. I mean, having now read a bunch about Trump over the years, this fits his I'm going to make a deal with short-term memory loss really, really well. And here's the other thing that I think is disappointing. We don't have time to get into this, though, Ken, because I do want to at least have a footnote on Gaza. But I think people are far more comfortable with this kind of governing than you or I would like. But that's yeah. And that is what Trump is going to do. He does not care about paper barriers in that sense. At all. Like, I don't think he's
right. Well, that's the same as saying he does not care about the rule of law or the U.S. Constitution.
No, I agree. I mean, that's absolutely. I don't disagree with you. On that front, I think we're in complete agreement.
Yeah. So it is, it's gonna really hurt a lot of things. I mean, not only is it hurting our relationships with our neighbors, which are important to not hurt, but also, Canada has already basically announced that because Trump is so mercurial, that even though, we have NAFTA and they've invested a lot in physical infrastructure to do stuff like move oil and gas from Canada to the United States so they can sell it here. That they're going to stop putting all their eggs in that basket, and they're now going to invest in more physical infrastructure that would make it possible for them to export some of their energy resources to Asia, which I think means China, although they use the word Asia. But they're doing that as a defensive move so that if something like this happens again, they'll have markets for their oil, and that once they make that investment, maybe they will start selling more of their energy into Asia than here. And that's not going to benefit us. That's going to drive energy prices up here and drive them down in China.
Well, it is undoubted. I mean, again, I think we are in agreement on this one. International policy wise, the erection of tariff barriers among democratic countries is nothing but a recipe for economic disaster. And I know that there is some disagreement among us, as you get outside of that circle. But let's save that. So Ken, let's do a 5-minute finish here with Gaza, because we can't end it. Because on Tuesday we have one more, Trump. Yeah. We get 2 bombshell ideas, according to NPR, as they put it. One, that the United States is going to take over Gaza as a territory. And 2, Gaza's entire population is going to be relocated. Here's Trump's comments. I'll just give it to you straight. He says, quote, "The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip. We'll own it. We have an opportunity to do something that phenomenal, the Riviera of the Middle East," end quote. He then went on to say, quote, "We should, for the second thing, quote, we should go to other countries of interest with humanitarian hearts. And there are many of them that want to do this and build various domains that will ultimately be occupied by 1.8 million Palestinians living in Gaza, ending the death, destruction, and frankly, bad luck," end quote. Israeli Prime Minister Anoud El-Mart said that, quote, every party involved except Israel is completely against it, end quote. Trump backed away from the idea that there would need any troops later this week on X and Truth Social, arguing that we wouldn't need any troops, but rather we would just be playing big. So, Ken, what is your takeaway from? I think this even kind of shocked Netanyahu and others as he's talking about it. What's your 5-minute takeaway?
Well, I know you're going to disagree with the first thing I'll say. Maybe you'll agree with a few things after that.
He's taking his orders from Putin.
Yes, exactly. That's it. I think it's hard to think of anything that could throw a grenade into all of our alliances, except for the one with Israel, more than this, all but one of our alliances. Every single ally that the U.S. has, except for Israel, is just appalled by that. And it's obviously not going to happen. It couldn't happen. It seems just like the only thing it could do is shake the confidence of our allies in the stability of our government and make all of our allies think that they have to think to a future where they're not allied with the U.S. Because it's insanity. As Jordan and Egypt were the first to say, they do not want these people and they will not take them. As every other Arab country was next to say, they cannot accept the violation of international law that that would involve the sort of forced movement of peoples from places where they live, by an occupying power. There are very few violations of international law much clearer than that one, and it wouldn't be acceptable to sort of the reminder of the worst of old colonialism being brought back to the Middle East. Is very upsetting there, and in Europe it's toxic, and so I think that's really all it does is just throw make our allies wonder how can they really stay allied with us. Trump himself, one of the reasons he got elected the first time around was criticizing the forever war in Afghanistan, and he is basically talking about committing us to a forever war in Gaza if this would actually happen, and but I don't
that's
think
why
it's
he said
serious.
no
It also
groups.
has the effect.
That's what I mean. I don't disagree with you, but I mean he's walking it back.
He's walking it back.
Yeah. Well,
And
I mean,
it
he just sounds. It sounds good.
Yeah.
It sounds good to say, hey.
In the week that Elon Musk was up to so much no good in the Treasury and all that, it helped distract some headlines away from that, I guess, too.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, Ken, I'm going to pause this right there and say I hope everybody has enjoyed our show, but we're not done. As we get done here, Ken and I are going to be doing, as we always do, a Constitution midweek show. And this week, we're taking on the 16th Amendment. So if you didn't like us getting into the weeds now, I got bad news or good news for you, depending on your point of view. So if you want to get that whole thing, you're going to need to be a supporter. If not, you're going to get like this really terrible 15-minute, and there's going to be all these ads in it, and it's not as much fun. So what you need to do is become a supporter of the Politics Guys to get access to our 16th Amendment show and so much more. Ken and I have the last several years been going through the Constitution. And I would like to let everybody know one of the cool things that will be coming up when Ken and I finish up with our supporters, all of these amendment shows. You're going to have an opportunity to get them all together as one prepackaged show. It's going to be a lot of fun. We got more news coming about that soon. But for right now, you're going to want to already be prepared for that by being a supporter of the Politics Guys. We've got all of the ways to become a supporter, a member of the show by heading to the show notes. You can also always head to politicsguys.com/support. Now, if like me, you are, don't have all the money in the world, you'd still like to get some of those shows, you can always send us an email at mail@politicsguys.com so that we can get you hooked up. It is always a big deal if you help us by subscribing, rating, and reviewing. We need those algorithms in our favor. The numbers are never in our favor. And the only way to make that happen is by you subscribing, rating, and reviewing right now. It also helps if you share these episodes with others. I want to finish, as I always do, with a special thanks to our executive producers of the Politics Guys, who are Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back, as always, with a full episode next weekend, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.